All right, good afternoon. The Secretary General, as you know, is in the Philippines today, where he addressed the 9th ASEAN UN Summit. He called on ASEAN's leaders to strengthen resilience and reduce the risk posed by climate change and other natural disasters. And he commended the 4,500 military personnel, police, and civilians from 8 ASEAN countries who are serving in UN peacekeeping missions around the world. The Secretary General emphasized the importance of regional cooperations against terrorism and violent extremism, as well as by the recent conflict in Marawi in the Philippines. He said the United Nations stands ready to provide technical support and assistance to ASEAN countries in their efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism and to combat transnational crimes, drugs, and people trafficking, with policies able to protect their civilians with effective law enforcement and respect for human rights. He also said that the dramatic movement of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Myanmar to Bangladesh is a worrying escalation in a protracted tragedy and a potential source of instability in the region. Beyond the end of the violence, he reiterated his calls for unhindered humanitarian access to affected communities and the right to safe, voluntary, and dignified return for all those who fled their place of origin. The Secretary General also noted that sustainable and inclusive development is the best way to prevent conflict and violent extremism. As this region powers its way to becoming the world's 4th largest economy by 2050, we look forward to including millions more in the shared benefits of prosperity, he said. Today in Manila, he also held a series of bilateral meetings with the Prime Ministers of Laos and Vietnam, as well as the President of Indonesia, and we have readouts of those. And as we previously announced, we will continue, the Secretary General will continue his meetings tomorrow before flying on to Bonn to attend the COP23. Turning to Yemen, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that the impact of the blockade is leading to severe shortages of commercial and aid material throughout the country. The entire population of Yemen is dependent on food, fuel, and medicine imports, primarily through seaports. More than 17 million Yemenis, or more than 2/3 of the population, are already food insecure. Without the import of critical commodities through a lifting of the blockade on all ports, including Hodeidah and Salif, the situation will deteriorate further. And as a point of reference, the World Food Program tells us that there are 111 days until the current stocks of rice runs out and 97 days until the current stocks of wheat runs out. More than 2/3 of people in Yemen in need, and more than 80% of all cholera cases are located in the areas closest to Hodeidah and Salif seaports. Only Al-Wadea land crossing in Hadramaut Governorate and Aden seaport are open for commercial imports. However, the port at Aden does not have the capacity for commercial and humanitarian cargo, and unless the Red Sea ports in Hodeidah and Salif are open immediately, the UN will not be able to feed 7 million people every month. The Department of Peacekeeping Operations today announced the appointment of Brigadier General Fernando Marcel Amoussou of Benin to lead an independent special investigation into a number of recent incidents in the southeast of the Central African Republic that occurred between 1st of May and 31 August of this year. This investigation will look into attacks against civilians by armed groups that occurred in close proximity to a UN mission presence in Haute-Koto, Basse-Koto, Mbumu, and Haute-Mbumu prefectures, as well as the mission's response to these incidents. The Peacekeeping Department is launching this special investigation in light of recent deterioration of the security situation in the southeast of the country, and with a view of improving the mission's ability to prevent violence and protect civilians under imminent threats within its capabilities and areas of deployment. The investigation will make recommendations to address any shortcomings, if applicable, and on the mission's overall performance with regard to the protection of civilians in the context of the mission's mandate renewal. The investigation team will deploy to the Central African Republic from the 14th to the 28th of November, that is starting tomorrow, and a final report will then be presented to the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. The findings of the report will be made public. Just as a note, retired General Amoussou had been the force commander of the UN mission in Côte d'Ivoire from 2006 to 2010. And staying on the subject of peacekeeping, Undersecretary General Lacroix and Undersecretary General for Field Support Atul Kare will be participating in the UN Peacekeeping Defense Ministerial meeting that begins in Vancouver tomorrow. Mr. Lacroix will be representing the Secretary General. Defense ministers and senior officials from more than 80 countries and organizations will attend this two-day event to discuss challenges we face in the field, our current and emerging capability needs, and how we can work together with member states to explore new solutions. Among the highlights of the conference will be a side event on Mali, which will take place tomorrow, on the critical capability gaps that the mission faces in the country and the generation of those key resources. The main day of the conference, Wednesday, kicks off with a session to encourage member states to mobilize the women, peace, and security agenda with their own military. A female UN peacekeeper will also be honored with the UN Military Gender Advocate of the Year award. Member states will have an opportunity to announce their pledges for UN peacekeeping on Wednesday, and we'll be providing you with daily updates from that conference. And you will see in the statement we issued last night expressing the Secretary General's sadness at the loss of life and damage following the earthquake that struck the border region between Iraq and Iran. The Secretary General conveyed his condolences to the bereaved families and to the government and people of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Republic of Iraq, and he wishes those injured a speedy recovery. The Secretary General commended the local response efforts underway, and the UN stands ready to assist if required. The humanitarian coordinator for Iraq, Lise Grande, said humanitarian's priority right now is to help local authorities respond as quickly as possible, and our country team in Iran has also been reaching out to local authorities. This morning, the World Health Organization sent an immediate response team and 2 ambulances to Suleimaniye Hospital, and the primary hospital in the Iraqi side of the area, along with trauma and surgical kits. An assessment team has arrived in Darbandinkan, one of the worst hit areas. And upon request of the Iraqi government, a UN disaster coordination team is also being dispatched from Geneva, this highly specialized team that will help assess conditions and coordinate the response. And turning to Syria, a UN International Committee of the Red Cross Syrian Arab Red Crescent interagency convoy delivered life-saving multi-sectoral assistance, including yesterday, that includes food, nutrition, and health items for more than 21,000 of the estimated 90,000 people in the need of Douma in the besieged area of East Ghouta in rural Damascus. The area was last reached by such a convoy in August of this year. Meanwhile, we're concerned about the protection and well-being of civilians in Atareb in rural Aleppo, following reports of infighting between different non-state armed groups over the past 5 years. Shelling on populated cities, towns in the area is affecting civilian movement, including commercial activities, and has interrupted humanitarian activities in the areas due to the clashes and the roadblocks. Furthermore, schools have reportedly suspended classes. And over the weekend in Bonn at the climate conference, countries, business, and civil society organizations showcased examples of climate action on various themes, including oceans and forests. Today, they'll be focusing on financing for climate action. Some of the commitments that have been made include an Ecuadorian initiative to reduce 15 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions in the forest sector, a commitment to deforestation-free commodities by Walmart, a new policy by the company Mars Incorporated to reduce their carbon footprint 27% by 2025 and 67% by 2050 through addressing deforestation throughout their corporate value chain, as well as Gabon's National Park Service efforts to act on illegal logging. In addition, the Fiji presidency of the COP announced an agreement on gender action plan, highlighting the role of women in climate action, which is subject to the adoption at the end of the conference. More information on the UNCCC's website. And just want to flag that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid al-Hussein, will be heading to El Salvador from the 15th to the 16th of November. That's the first ever visit by High Commissioner for Human Rights. He was expected to meet with the President, the Foreign Minister, Minister of Justice and Public Security, as well as legislators. The High Commissioner is also scheduled to meet civil society representatives and human rights defenders, and he will attend a ceremony to mark the 28th anniversary of the murder of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeepers and her daughter, by government soldiers. He'll then go on to Guatemala for a 2-day visit from the 17th to the 18th of November, and he's expected to meet with the presidents of the Supreme Court of Justice, Constitutional Court, the Foreign Minister, and others, and he's also scheduled to meet with human rights defenders, victims, and journalists. And our colleagues at the International Labour Organization will host their 4th global conference on sustained eradication of child labor, starting tomorrow in Buenos Aires in Argentina. The conference will address the consolidation of the global commitment to eradicate this practice, and government, employers, and workers' representatives will be discussing proposals to develop policies and ensure education for all children and a seamless transition to the labor market. And I also want to flag that this week is Antibiotic Awareness Week, kicking off today with the theme, Learn How to Handle Antibiotics with Care. As you know, the overuse of antibiotic and the development of drug resistance microbes is a big issue, and you can find out more about it on the World Health Organization's website. After I'm done, you will be facing Brendan Varma, or Brendan Varma will be facing you on behalf of the PGA. Then at 1 p.m., the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, Ambassador Al-Mualimi, permanent representative of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, will be briefing you. 2:30, briefing here entitled 2018 on the Winter Olympic Games in the Republic of Korea and the GA resolution. And at 3:15, Ambassador Sergio Solis, permanent representative of Bolivia, will be at the Security Council stakeout for you. That's why he will be there. I will now take your questions. Mr. Bays.
Follow-up question on the statement you read on Yemen. Saudi Arabia has said it's going to ease its blockade, but so far it's announcing that, well, nothing has happened yet, but the areas that it's going to allow aid to go to are areas its coalition controls, whereas there's no aid going to be allowed for now to the areas the Houthis control. How concerned are you about this, given the grim warning from Mr. Lowcock last week?
Well, you know, obviously we've taken note of the Saudi announcement regarding the humanitarian assistance for the Secretary General. He will continue to insist once more on full and unimpeded access for humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen, as well as the free movement in and out of Yemen for humanitarian workers. I would also add, because I think there were some questions raised, that the Secretary General has categorically condemned the attack on Riyadh last week with the missiles, as he does with all indiscriminate attacks on civilians. You know, obviously, we have to wait to see what actually comes into comes into being. What is important for us, as I said, is that the ports that we need access to are the ones where the humanitarian needs are the greatest, and that includes Zeid and Al Salif seaports. Obviously, we welcome the opening of other ports, but those are the ones that we need. You don't want to get into a situation where the transport of aid is made more complicated by having to cross combat lines and front lines. We see that we see the challenges that poses in Syria. And I think for here, we have the needs that we have. The Yemeni people have the needs that we've talked about at length here, and we need to meet them. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Stephane. You mentioned that the Secretary General condemns this attack on Riyadh, which was intercepted. The rocket was intercepted, and according to the Saudi sources, it did not result in any damages. However, hardly any day passes in Yemen without a massacre targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Does the Secretary General condemns each and every one of these massacres.
Nizar, I think you've been at almost every one of my briefings. I think you will have heard each and every condemnation on attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure that takes place in Yemen. I think the fact that we have called those out and we have condemned those is really a fairly easy fact to check.
Does the Secretary General calls for any particular action with regard, because these have been repeated almost on daily basis for 2.5 years? Does he call for any particular...
We have been calling, we continue to call for a halt to the fighting. We have been calling, we continue to call for a recommitment to the political talks. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, wherever they are, should not be targeted, regardless of who they are. And we've condemned all of those attacks.
Well, should they be referred, for example, to ICC?
Okay, the International Criminal Court is an independent body. What we know is that these attacks need to stop, and our focus right now is on getting the humanitarian aid. I mean, I gave you we have a countdown. I mean, according to my colleagues at WFP, 111 days until the rice runs out, 97 until the wheat runs out. What we're already seeing is a spike in food prices. We're seeing a spike in fuel prices. The supplies of fuel, the supplies of diesel are not endless. Those two are running low. And I don't think anyone wants to contemplate what happens when the diesel runs out. Trucks don't move, water pumps don't work, electrical generators don't work. Mr. Lee.
Sure. I wanted to...
Go ahead.
I've been looking closely at this Environmental Investigation Agency report about this, among other things, the Deputy Secretary General and her role in signing thousands of certificates for Rosewood. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. They just because I heard the statement that the Secretary General stands behind her, and I wonder, first of all, can you say, has he read the whole report?
Secretary General is fully aware of the report and the accusations therein.
Okay, so I guess my question is, they quote directly a member of the Wood Exporters Association saying that Chinese businessmen traveled to Abuja and paid a minister. They didn't say who the minister is, but so he's very clear that is the Deputy Secretary General aware of any payments by Chinese businessmen to Nigerian officials involving the export of this rosewood?
What the Deputy Secretary General is very clear on, she has never taken any sort of illicit money, and she rejects categorically the accusations herein to the report. As for any other questions having to do with the functioning of the federal government of Nigeria, I would encourage you to ask the Nigerian government.
Can you see why signing thousands of certificates right before she came to the UN seems strange? Do you at least acknowledge that? And I have another question there, because in the report they actually say that much of this wood came from Cameroon. So I want to ask you directly, when she signed the certificates, what was her understanding of where the wood at issue? Because she definitely acknowledges signing the certificates and that the wood, there's some dispute of when it left Nigerian shores.
I think I would refer you to the statement that we issue. She categorically refutes any claims that she signed illicit or any forged documents. She only dealt with issues having to do with wood coming from Nigeria.
I guess my question is this: is that I've seen she did an interview, I guess over the weekend at some point, with something called The Cable in Nigeria, and she said that she's been asked by a Chinese journalist about the timing between the certificates and the wood leaving. And so I'm just wondering, what is the procedure to actually get direct answers to these questions? Is she fielding questions by phone from Chinese journalists? Do we write to
First of all, I mean, I don't think it is spokesman-like ethics to tell another journalist what contacts others are having. So that's not what I would get into. I would refer you to the statement that I read out last week, which I think covers your answers. If you have more questions, you can provide them. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I'm jumping around here. Go ahead.
Stephane, just to get back to Yemen, the Saudi statement yesterday mentioned an invitation to the UN to send experts to Riyadh. Have you received?
Sure, we're aware of the invitation, and we're taking a look. We're taking a look at it. Evelyn.
Yes. So on Yemen, which are the Red Sea ports? Is it Hodeida or that WFP and others saying they need?
It's the two that I just
Sorry,
that I read out, Hodeida and Al-Salif. Yes.
Do you have new information on Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, whether he is under house arrest or not?
No, we have no way to confirm the nature of his presence in Saudi Arabia, whether he's even in Saudi Arabia. Our concern at the situation, the political situation in Lebanon continues. I think everybody would benefit from some clarity. Yes, sir.
Today, Mr. Mladinov issued a statement in which he said the militants in Gaza risk a dangerous escalation. He said their reckless actions and statements. So what does he mean by reckless actions? And two of the factions issued a strong statement against this statement, accusing Mladinov of being biased, covering for the Israeli occupation. He is silent when 12 Palestinians were killed, but when a Palestinian faction said they will take revenge of this action of Israel, he issued this strong statement, calling it reckless
okay, what is
actions.
I mean, with all due respect, what is the question?
The question, do you have any comment on the statement issued by the two militants against accusing him of being biased?
Issued you know, I think if we showed you the number of times we also get complaints from the Israeli side, I think no one can accuse Mr. Mladinov of being biased. I think it comes, we get complaints from Palestinians, we get complaints from Israelis about Mr. Mladinov's action. Mr. Mladinov speaks when he feels it is appropriate for him to speak. What we do not want to see is an escalation in violence. I think the agreement to reassert the authority of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza is an important one, and everything should be done to support that.
But he used the word action. This is my question also. I mean, to condemn the reckless statement, one thing, but to condemn the reckless actions, there was no actions on the part of the Palestinian factions.
I will leave my answer as already been spoken. Yes, sir.
Sure. I want to ask you about another report, the Small Arms Survey report, highly critical of UN peacekeeping for losing or not keeping track of weapons. They say they could, basically arm a whole militia. But one of the issues seems to be when arms are collected through cordon and search or other ones. Does the UN acknowledge that there is a problem? Do they disagree with this survey? What steps are being taken to address this?
Our colleagues in peacekeeping have noted the findings of the report. They obviously take very seriously the performance of peacekeepers, including any loss of arms and ammunition. I think what's regrettable that the reports, I think, distorts some of the context as well as the figures and implies that the loss of weapons have a large impact on conflict. I think the percentage of the loss of weapons in peacekeeping operations are, I think, as we know, very much an exception. The number of weapons that are lost is extremely small, far less than 0.5% of the total amount of weapons and ammunition in circulation around conflict zones such as Darfur and South Sudan. Where the loss occur, they're often a consequence of military operations in very challenging conditions, and they occur despite the best efforts of the troops involved. In circumstances where troop contributors' poor performance is a contributory factor, the UN has done as much to improve performance, working closely with member states and the training, skills, and equipment of peacekeepers. I think the report itself acknowledges that despite some shortcomings in the stockpile management and accountability of contingent-owned equipment, UN policies and practices are far more advanced than in many other organizations.
I want to ask you about one related arms collection question, which is over the weekend in Cameroon, in both the Northwest and Southwest, there was a collection, apparently in light of not only armaments, rifles and handguns, but even hose and cutlasses, it said. Basically a total disarmament and impinging on even farming work by people. And I'm wondering, given that Francois Fall has called for dialogue, what is the UN is aware of this? There are written orders online that you can see telling people to turn all of these things in.
I have nothing on these reports as of now. Yes, Evelyn.
Does the SG intend to have a bilateral with the president of the Philippines?
No, there's nothing. I mean, they saw each other at the gala opening. They shook hands, but there's no bilateral schedule as far as I'm aware.
Nothing on human rights schedule.
There's no bilateral as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Nizar and then
Yeah.
Abdelhamid.
Mr. Guterres mentioned on Friday that he is doing contacts with leaders in the region regarding the absence of Mr. Hariri. When he talks to the Saudis, and of course since Friday probably he has talked to the Saudi authorities, how do they explain the freedom of Mr. Hariri to leave or remain in the country? Do they allow him to leave at his will?
I think, Nizar, I think it's a very good question. I would wait till 1 o'clock until the Saudi ambassador is here. Abdelhamid.
Yes, Stephane, the BBC has uncovered details of a deal that led hundreds of IS fighters, including foreign militants, and their families escape from Raqqa, which is under the gaze of the US, Britain, and the Kurdish groups. Well, doesn't that make mockery of this war on terrorism? Do you have any statement? Are you aware of this
I
report?
haven't seen the. I haven't seen
It's
the.
on
the
BBC.
I would be the last person to ever doubt the veracity of a report that you read to me. I'm just saying I haven't read it. I haven't read it personally. As to whether or not it makes a mockery of the war on terror, I think, as far as the Secretary General is concerned, the whole issue of counterterrorism is one that needs to be look at the bigger picture, not only obviously the security aspects of it, but the human rights, the international law, and global development. Thank you.
Mystery ASG, will you get?